Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, the MHRA Board Meeting held in public. It is my pleasure to introduce Stephen Lightfoot, Chairman of the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency. Over to you, Stephen.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Alex, and good morning, everybody. Welcome to this board meeting held in public. As Alex said, my name is Stephen Lightfoot, and I was appointed as the new chair of the MHRA in September. And it's a real privilege to have been given this opportunity. But as it's also the first board meeting held in public since the pandemic began, I'd like to start by publicly thanking my predecessor, Professor Sir Michael Rawlings, who made a significant contribution to this agency over the last 6 years. And not only that, in other organisations too, with NICE, the Committee of Safety of Medicines, and he's really contributed to the health of this country for many years. So thank you, Mike. Your support and advice and counsel has been very well received and very gratefully received at that. So in terms of this particular board meeting, this is also going to be the first MHRA board meeting held in public that's going to be live streamed. And I'm delighted today that we're going to be watched by 49 members of the public, including 16 with affiliations to patient groups, 15 students from King's College, 5 people from research organisations, 4 patients or parents of patients, and 3 representatives from industry. So we've got a broad church that will be watching us today. We're also going to record the meeting so that we can actually make this available to other members of the public to watch at their convenience, and also we'll make it available for our staff to see as well. So although this is not the first time that we've used this particular technology as an agency, it is the first time we've used it for a board meeting. And on that basis, I think that what I do hope is this approach will give us the opportunity to be able to reach more people than we've ever been able to do before. So by having it live streamed and also having it broadcast on recording, with more people across the country will be able to see our board business, to see how we make decisions, than would be practically possible through a normal face-to-face meeting in our London offices. Although this may well be a learning curve, and I think on that basis, if people do have any feedback on how we can improve this format for the future, then they'd be very gratefully received after the meeting. So I think in terms of today's priorities, the first priority will be showing people how our agency board operates, but also providing a vital opportunity for patients and the members of the public to ask questions. But of course, I should remind you that this is a board meeting held in public. It is not a public meeting. And on that basis, the board will discuss and agree the actions around each agenda item first. And then, if there's time, we'll take the opportunity to ask if there are any specific questions from members of the public on the agenda items. But perhaps more importantly, we've allocated 30 minutes at the end of this particular session so that members of the public can ask a question on any subject, within reason, of course. And certainly, as Alex said at the very beginning, there's an opportunity to do that either through pre-submitted questions, which we'll answer at 12:30, or alternatively through the questions section on the screen in front of you. So I think what we'll do as far as the questions are concerned is that Rachel Bosworth, Rachel, can you just give us a wave? So Rachel's our Director of Communications, and Rachel will read them out so everybody can hear the questions. So again, we want to be quite open about what we're being asked so that we can come up with the appropriate response. Now, there's also going to be a few differences to the way that this particular board meeting is being run compared to our previous sessions. And the first is that the composition of the board has changed. And that's following a governance review that we held during the summer. We've decided to create a truly unitary board with myself as the non-executive chair, but also 7 executive directors or chief officers, as we've decided to call them, and 7 independent non-executive directors. Now, we've still got some vacancies to recruit, but this is the board structure that we're going to be working towards to have completed in 2021. But with that in mind, I think it'd be just useful just to have a few quick introductions around the screen so that members of the public can see who we all are. So first of all, I'd just like to introduce Dr. June Rain. So June, can you just give us a wave? June's our chief executive, and you'll be hearing a lot of her during this meeting because she'll get all the difficult questions. I'd also like to introduce John Fundry. He's our chief operating officer. John, give us a wave. Thank you. Dr. Sam Atkinson, who's our Chief Quality and Access Officer. It's up in the top corner there. We've got Dr. Christian Schneider, who's our Chief Scientific Officer. And then we've got John Quinn, who's our Chief Technology Officer. In the same way, I'd like to introduce our independent non-executive directors. And this is an important role because actually these individuals bring in external experience that's related to our area of business, but actually have got that independence that can ask, again, difficult searching questions. So in alphabetical order, can we just start with Dr. Barbara Bannister? Give us a wave, Barbara. Perfect. We've got Mandy Calvert. We've got Professor Bruce Campbell. We've got Mercy Jessingham, just up in the top there. Anthony Rogers. Thank you, Anthony. And Professor David Webb, who's also our Deputy Chair. And Michael Whitehouse, who's also our Chair of our Audit and Risk Assurance Committee. We're also joined today by Liz Wooderson, who's our Director of Medicines and Pharmacy at the Department of Health, and Alistair Hardesty, who's our Head of MHRA Sponsorship at the Department of Health. We've got Elizabeth O'Neill, who I think is actually on the line. So Elizabeth from our Government Legal Department. And also we have our people from the devolved administration. So we've got Chris Garland, who's the Principal Pharmaceutical Officer from Northern Ireland. So pleased to have you here, Chris. Alison Strath may well be on the line, but she's certainly been invited. I can't see her on screen, but I think Alison Strath, the Interim Chief Pharmaceutical Officer of Scotland, is here. And also Kerry Chalmers has joined us, who's responsible for medical devices in Scotland. So pleased to have you here as well then, Kerry. And last but by no means least, we've got the lady who's got to take all the notes and the minutes. That's Natalie Richards, who's deputising for Aidan McIver, who's ill today. So that's a few quick introductions. So as you see, the board composition has changed. The second key difference, by the way, we're going to organise our meetings is that I've limited the number of people attending, but also reduced the number of agenda items so that we can actually focus on the most important issues that as a board that we need to consider. Now, again, for the benefit of members of the public, it's really important to say that this board does not take regulatory decisions on individual products. That's very firmly in the purview of the executive team. Having said that, this board is responsible for the strategic leadership of the agency. And that's why our agenda is structured around 4 key strategic priorities. That's around patient safety, healthcare access, a dynamic organisation, and also financial sustainability. So today's meeting will in fact start with a session on the current context. So this is the thoughts of our Chief Executive, June Rain, who will talk about some of the current issues facing the agency. On healthcare access, we're going to talk about the assurance on the regulation of COVID-19 vaccines. But what is important to say is we're not going to be talking about individual COVID-19 vaccine products. We'll also be talking about the assurance that we've got on our readiness to operate after we've left the EU systems on the 1st of January 2021. And that's only 66 days away. So that operational readiness is a vitally important paper for us to consider. On patient safety, we're going to consider the actions and the many actions that we're taking in response to the Cumberledge review. And these are the actions that are directly applicable to the MHRA. And then on dynamic organisation, I'll be presenting a paper for the board to discuss and agree the new assurance framework for the agency. So there won't be a paper on financial sustainability this month, and that's quite deliberately so we could allow more time for questions from the public. So that's the introduction. Hopefully quite a lot of information there, but can I just check that I've covered everything I was supposed to cover at the start of this meeting? Have I missed anything? I don't think so. Okay. That being the case then, if we could then sort of go to the board pack, please. And first of all, just ask if there are any apologies or declarations of interest. I've had an apology from Liam Smith, our non-executive director, who's on leave at the moment, but I don't think we've got any other apologies from members. Okay, do we have any declarations of interest that would affect any item on the agenda today? I'm seeing no raised hands, so I'll take that as a no. Okay, so if we can look at the minutes of the last meeting, please. Can I first of all just check that they are a true record of the last meeting that we held on the 21st of September? That's a thumbs up from David. So as deputy chair, I'll take, and a thumbs up from Mercy. So that's good. So okay, let's take those as read. In terms of then the actions, so just moving on to page number 8 in the board pack. So in terms of the first action was to present a paper on our ability to assess and determine multiple license applications for COVID. That's on the agenda, so we'll cover that shortly. Similarly, action number 2 is on the agenda. In terms of action number 3, that's about presenting an overview of how device registries, unique device identifiers and device databases are being developed across the health system. That's not due until November, so we'll come back to that next month. We've had some paper that's been circulated by John Quinn to the board on patient safety IT systems, so that's been circulated, I know that. We're going to set up a board seminar to discuss more widely how we can engage patients, so that will be done in November. And then in terms of presenting the high-level actions, that's paper's also been circulated by John Fundry. So from my point of view, I think the 6 actions that we agreed have been appropriately actioned. Is there any other matters arising from those minutes? Again, I can't see any hands raised, so I assume that the answer is no. So that being the case then, I think I should hand over, I've spoken for quite long enough now, June. So can I hand over to you, June, just to present the key points from your paper in terms of the key highlights of what's happening from the Chief Executive's point of view. June, over to you.
June, can I ask a quick question? Do you want questions as you're going through, or do you want us to wait to the end?
No, we'll allow June to speak and then we'll take questions.
Fine.
Thanks very much indeed, Stephen. And may I start by saying how pleased that I and members of the Executive Committee are to be meeting today in the Public Board. It's a great step forward and hugely appreciated. So this report gives an overview of the current major priority areas for the agency, and it's intended to be a suitable context for the papers that are to come on the agenda around our capacity for COVID-19 vaccines regulation, our response to the Independent Medicines and Medical Devices Safety Review, and of course the preparations for EU exit transition. And what we're going to do, and thanks to Antony for leaping in there, is have a really good discussion about those priorities. Are we getting them right? And as you can see, we group them under the 4 main strategic areas: healthcare access, patient safety, the dynamic organisation we're building, and financial sustainability. So there's something under each of these, but I hope you'll forgive me if I pick out some highlights. And in a nutshell, we have particular priorities clearly around COVID, vaccines, therapeutics and diagnostics, now that we're entering and well into the second wave. We have priorities around patient engagement and involvement, and it's a real pleasure that so many patient organisations and indeed patients or families are able to join today. And last but not least, a major priority is our programme for change. Huge change is coming, but those changes bring incredible opportunities. So I'll highlight some of the key issues, and I'll go back and start with COVID-19. We are proud to be at the forefront and closely integrated with the nation's battle to defeat this virus. And we are looking to play an important role that ensures successful deployment and licensing of vaccines, therapeutics and diagnostics for COVID-19. And while we'll be talking about the vaccines in more detail shortly, I'd just like to highlight for the board our huge, intense preparations in the hopes that at some point we'll be handling multiple vaccines for COVID to the highest of scientific standards and with true regulatory independence. And so once deployment begins, our focus will be on really robust monitoring of safety as we learn more in clinical use. In terms of the therapeutics, we have an expert working group that's meeting very regularly, usually every fortnight, to look at issues around new data, for example, the recent data on remdesivir. important news is that our National Institute for Biological Standards and Control is now a fully fledged partner with the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, CEPI, not only to look at the immune responses across a package of vaccines, but also to develop an antibody that will be used right around the world for regulators and developers to calibrate their tests. On the subject of tests, we're playing a frontline role, particularly by publishing target product profiles, and there was one out just last week, so developers know what performance to aim for. And last but not least is our global information sharing. We're very connected in with the International Coalition for Medicines Regulatory Authorities, particularly working with Health Canada and also with the Therapeutic Goods Administration in Australia to make sure that we're constantly testing our own approaches and informing those of others. I'll move briefly to our second big priority area, and that's our patient and public engagement and involvement strategy. And you'll know from obviously what we've been saying ever since we knew which direction the independent review, the Cumberledge review, was heading, that our strategy to improve our engagement and involvement of patients and the public in everything we do is well underway. We had a big survey last year that took views right around the UK, and it gave us some very clear direction. And therefore, we're now due to publish a strategy later this autumn and certainly before the end of the year. But this isn't all about the future. What are we doing right now? We're seeking input from patient groups on safety issues. We're feeding in patient views on our innovation strategy. We're looking particularly at something very important, which is patient-reported outcomes. And we have a special interest group there. And for our own staff, we have an induction programme for new starters, and there'll be a training programme for current staff as to how to always think of the patient when you're making a decision. These initiatives will all help to ensure that patients and the public are at the heart of everything we do. Now, the third big area, and there's a lot more in this report, but let's move to the third big area, which is our agency change programme. And Stephen, you've already mentioned the unitary board and our new governance structure. And I'd like the board to be aware that this is alive and well. Our staff have asked us, what does an agile structure mean? Well, our executive committee met this morning. We meet twice a week. We meet formally for formal papers every fortnight. And all of this means that we're taking decisions in real time as issues come up. Obviously, we want to look ahead beyond our new ExCo, Executive Committee, through to our management committees that are all coming into being this month or very early next. And in parallel, we've begun phase 2, which means that we're looking at all the processes and skills and structures and ways of working that we need in the future to deliver the vision that the board has said is the right one, those 4 areas that you've highlighted with patients at the core of what we do. So we're well on the way. We're 5 weeks off finishing phase 2. And what that will deliver for the board to look at together is a future operating model. And that's something that will be a matter of real debate, and I'm sure some really important choices. And then moving forward from that to implementation well into 2021, but we're already looking to how that will work. So there's a lot of information in this report. I hope it will help provide a very broad context for our discussions today, but just to highlight that on each of our ExCo members, the chiefs and myself, there are the 3 main priorities: delivering for the public for COVID, patient engagement, and our change strategy. And we must achieve success in all of these if we're to be the agency we aspire to be. So I'll stop there, Stephen, but very happy to open the debate and answer all the questions.
Okay, well, thank you, June. I think in addition to the things you've mentioned, actually, the other thing that particularly is worth noting, I think, is around the international work. And I think the work on Project Orbis, obviously, I think, and also on the Access Consortium. And I think strategically for the agency, they're very important, so that we're very much involved with the global regulation of products, not just the UK. And I think our influence is going to be very important in the future years to come. So I was delighted to see that, and very grateful for the work that's been done. Can I ask colleagues, are there any specific questions? David, we can come to you first. I think you're on mute, David.
I'm sorry, very poor at this sort of game. So I wanted to pick up on page 4, the bottom of page 4, the spending review bid. And obviously I recognise the importance of an efficient and agile organisation. But I was worried about the implications of the question of efficiency savings in relation to NIBSC. Everyone knows NIBSC is right at the centre of the COVID crisis at the moment. And in addition, it has a very important international role in standardisation, looking after more than 95% of WHO standards. In the NHS, my experience of efficiency savings is cuts, not savings. And I'm just worried that these efficiency savings might have an adverse effect on NIBSC to carry out its national and international role. So I'd just like to be reassured on that point.
June?
Well, thank you, David, and colleagues. This truly is at a high level of priority. What we're doing with the spending review is making an ambitious but realistic bid that really focuses on the capabilities around innovation. As you say, NIBS's scientific preeminence worldwide is at the heart of that. Now, the bid has been warmly received, as we understand, but obviously the Chancellor is going to make some tough judgments in the present context. But I can give the board my full assurance that this will be something we continue to press. And as emphasised, the recognition by CEPI that it isn't just for patients and the public in the UK, but those round the world, what NIBSC does is absolutely vital. And many colleagues will have noticed the really interesting work around monitoring COVID through waste water, which again builds on the incredible technology that has been used for polio, in fact, that NIBSC is at the forefront in. So please understand, we are batting furiously hard to make sure that all of this national treasure that is NIBSC, that has such huge value internationally, will be part of eradicating polio and no doubt integral to, who knows, seeing off this virus. Is really at the front of every highly positioned person's decision.
And I can support June on that, David, because at a departmental, a quarterly accountable meeting with the Department of Health last week, we discussed funding. At a ministerial meeting last week, we discussed funding. And so it's front and centre of a number of our current conversations at the moment. So I think you can be assured that we're absolutely making the argument for the funding that we need to fulfil the functions we need. If I come to Michael, you had your hand up.
June, thank you very much for the paper. It's ever very clear. My question relates to paragraph 4, and I really support and impressed by the work that's been done with DHSS and NICE to move to a validated list of COVID-19 tests. I know we'll come on to the vaccine later. I suspect my question really relates to the intense media coverage at the moment, often, sometimes not always helpful, around testing. Are we confident, and I know we're only one player, that we're moving to some stability in the United Kingdom around what tests work and in what circumstances? Because I think that's an issue that the public are increasingly concerned about.
Thank you for highlighting this, and it is a matter of very real concern. The agency's playing its part on a number of fronts. Clearly, there's rapidly evolving science and technology in this area and a total profusion of developers. And so the first thing that the public needs to know is that we are absolutely focused on the delivery of tests that work, and with the ambition, particularly that all of us can test at home and have a result easily and then know what we're able to do. It's a goal that we're not quite there yet. But step by step on the science, we are getting there. We are integrated at the deployment level with the amazing work that our DHSC colleagues have been doing at such pace to reach, I think is it 500,000 by the end of this month. So the answer to your question, in a sense, is through the integration, but I really want to stress the science that is key to this. For someone who is not technically in this space myself, it needs to understand what is the purpose for which the performance is needed. Someone sick in hospital, someone who has been in contact, someone who feels quite well and just needs to know what aspects of life they can participate in. So it's complex scientifically, it's complex in deployment, but all the skills that we are using are involved really at the front end. And what I would say is that we've learned so much so far during COVID that bending a few rules and issuing what we call derogations, which is not asking a developer to go through a lot of hoops, but to be absolutely on the front foot and say yes when it's soon as it's ready to say yes, then we're doing that. And we've issued more derogations in the last 6 months than we do in years. So this is our role, is to get these scientifically scrutinised and out as soon as the conditions are met.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you. I think practically, though, I think this is a really good example of being a pragmatic, agile regulator. You know, the derogations are an important part of the function. So I don't see it as breaking the rules. I see it as actually being pragmatic in a situation of national crisis. So I think that regulatory flexibility and agility is really important for the safety of patients and public across the country. Mandy, did you want to come in on this particular topic?
Yes, I was going to raise something similar. I think in terms of the TPP, I think that's a really excellent way of communicating what's required. My question is more about the controls that are then put in place, particularly around the data, because there's the technology around the testing, but also the validation and controls around accuracy of data, which is then communicated. And I was trying to understand the role that the agency has in that, because we've talked about our role with data, which is quite complicated, but that validation both of the data and then ongoing validation of the tests themselves in terms of laboratories, inspections, those sort of controls afterwards.
It's a really good point, and we do have a life cycle approach. When the data packages are received, the agency has a role in determining whether there's been adequate demonstration in enough samples that the tests are reliable and work. And then once they go into deployment, possibly after a derogation or some other route, they are then monitored. We have a surveillance approach. You'll probably have seen, particularly in the news, about fake tests, for example. So the life cycle approach ensures that we're ready to intervene and to act appropriately in the public interest, whatever the data are that come our way. So right throughout use. I'm hoping and planning with the board's support very much through our innovation strategy to scale up in this area. We're recruiting, we're ensuring that our expert advisory committee, the Devices DIAC, has a member who is an expert in this area. His name's on a recent pathology report into this area. I won't announce it at this moment, but we're strengthening scientifically and in capacity, which is really important to meet public expectations and our own.
Okay, Barbara, you wanted to come in.
There, I'm unmuted. Yeah, I was going to emphasise, and June has already said some of this, that bringing lots of new medicines and devices into operation is only possible to do in the way that we're doing it because we have such a world-class system of vigilance for particularly new medicines and devices, but ongoing vigilance, which you'll hear more about, because this has been a platform for us to develop our excellence in vigilance, which we are already using in other places in the world as well. So I hope you'll look forward to hearing about that.
Well, thank you. If I can quickly reflect back to your really helpful point, Barbara, it enables me to say we have been working closely. I mentioned the International Coalition, which is worldwide regulators. I think there's usually about 60 from all over, from Nigeria through to Iceland. They're all there, but closely led by ourselves and Australia, so that we can actually use again their experience and our own to develop the optimal approaches. We also want to use the opportunities of new modalities, artificial intelligence, to help us screen large bodies of safety information so that we can get onto those signals really quickly. It's what the public would expect, and we call it our real-time, particularly for vaccines, vigilance, so that anything that the public share with us through their own experience is picked up, flagged up, and looked at really quickly.
Okay, Bruce, you want to come in?
So just pursuing the international aspect, which has been emphasized in various parts of your report, can you just be a little bit clearer about what it is in our international conversations and collaboration that is being facilitated? I mean, you've explained very clearly what we're doing here in terms of derogations and the like, but what is it about our international collaborations that may be speeding things up, facilitating the whole provision of successful vaccines?
Well, thank you. This is a good if you like, way of looking at it. The preparedness, particularly for vaccines and COVID in particular, has started some little time ago, so that we are ready with the methodological approaches to undertake active surveillance, and also work around communication. So the way work would be shared, this example is that Australia took the lead on communications around benefits and risks of vaccines, whereas we have worked with the European agency, in fact, on the methodologies. So we decide upfront what needs to be done, where the best resources are, and how it can be brought to the point of delivery in a timely way, commensurate with when vaccines might come on stream. You probably heard that we're looking at next year largely with a very slim chance that a vaccine might be available for healthcare workers before the end of the year. So we have to be absolutely pitch perfect ready, and dividing the work is the best way to do that. Orbis is a great example where time matters for cancer patients. And we've managed to, through our observing so far, we haven't actually issued licenses, but we've seen how by sharing the work and building on the various strengths in different organisations, take a lot of time out of delivering approvals. So that's something that one gets to know when you're with these other colleagues. Pocket of expertise, we've talked about vigilance, it could be in preclinical assessment. So the strengthening of the system as a whole is building on the sum of the parts. Orbis is very exciting indeed, because cancer patients don't want to wait any longer than they have to. And we can take months off the usual time frame by working in this collaborative way.
Okay, Anthony.
Thanks, Chair. I've got an observation and a question. So the observation is really for Rachel to take back to the team. As you know, I'm connected to all of the things like Facebook and things like that, and I do look at them. And I've been really pleased to see the alerts on the opioid-containing medicines. But one of the interesting things about it is I don't have a family of people who have pharmacology backgrounds like I do, or academics, and it's quite interesting that a lot of them don't know what opioids are. So I'm wondering if we can look at how we target some of those communications, perhaps around the types of medicines or the conditions that people are taking these medicines for. I know that you do that in other areas, and I know you've done it through like Coronation Street and the soaps, and you've done some really great work. But on these public forum, I think we might just need to tweak some of the language a bit. So that's my observation, Rachel, if that's okay. Great. And my question,
maybe I can just, through you, Stephen, welcome Antoni's intervention there. It's something that we're always trying to get a balance on. These are really important medicines. And if we overemphasize risks, then that may impede someone having all the benefits that they can obtain at the time they need. What we've done recently is focus very much on how long you should need an opioid and, if necessary, a treatment plan. But your point about opioids, I mean, the usual point that sometimes gets made is it's like morphine. But for a lot of people who don't have a life-limiting illness, being told it's like morphine is quite a difficult concept. So, Rachel, do you have any comments about how well we're tuning our balanced communications? And when patients get brought in to actually give a final decision on whether a communication is fit for purpose?
Yes, absolutely. We absolutely do test communications with representative of patient groups on quite a regular basis. So, for example, the communications on warfarin, which are mentioned in the Chief Executive's report, were tested with both patient groups and charities, and a number of changes made before those communications were released. So we're very alive to that, but thank you for that helpful feedback, Anthony, and we'll take that back.
Okay.
Thanks. I did have a question, Chair, which was around valproate, June. On point 9, I think it is, you talk, sorry, page 4, we're talking about the wider work with the NHS. Now, I know from previous discussions at the board, we've started really in-depth work with NICE and with some of the colleges. I wonder if you could just give us an update on how that's going, because we've talked before about the fact this has to be a system-based approach, and my concern is that we sort of kick that off and then it doesn't move forward. So I'd just be keen for an update if that's okay.
Well, that's really good, and I hope we'll come back in more detail when we come to the question on the agenda. What's the MHRA doing to address the recommendations of Cumberledge? Certainly, we're working very closely with the valproate safety implementation group that NHS England and Improvement have up and running, and that's making sure that we're getting right through to those that are working clinically the right messages. One of our senior team sits on that group to ensure that the points are really integrated. It is a challenge, and we'll talk later, because again, a question of benefits and risks here. And those at the front line are the ones who have these difficult judgments and communications to give. But we're closely integrated, and I'm pleased to say all of that work is moving, pending, of course, the government's response. And we'll perhaps touch on more detail later on the agenda.
So perhaps you could come back to us about the MOI with NICE at a future meeting, the Memorandum of Understanding, and how that's developing. Yeah, because I think that's going to be a key document to change that relationship and make it partnership rather than two separate items.
Yeah, I think it's the saying, isn't it? Better together than trying to define why we're different. And I'm really pleased. We had a helpful conference mid-September, and I was with one of their senior people, Minded Boyson, and we really started to do that very thing. Why are we similar rather than why are we different? And then particularly to combine forces, it's going to be quite interesting with our innovation pathway to do exercises in patient engagement jointly. And all to play for. But yes, we'll bring the MOU back to have your views.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Mercy, would you like to have the last question?
Thank you. I'm going to change the subject slightly. Diversity inclusion, it's great to note that we're going to have a lead on that. And just a little bit of reassurance that it's going to work across all services, not just look at workforce, but also services, but also patient and public engagement. So that was one part of my question, June. And the other one on patient and public engagement is, are we trying to systematically get feedback from patients who are involved in different committees like expert working groups and the Commission on Human Medicines and people who we don't, directly have kind of maybe direct influence on, but we obviously want to know how it's going with them and what we can learn from it.
Well, those are really two good points, and I'll pick up the first one. Maybe Rachel might want to say a little bit more about our patient group consultative forum that pulls in some of the colleagues who are lay members on committees and patient representatives. On the first one, yes, There have been really impressive responses right across our agency to the need to refresh and re-look at our diversity and inclusion policy, and the appointment of Anousheh at the beginning of October is really giving us liftoff. You're quite right, it's not simply for internal processes like recruitment and promotion, talent management, it's for all our services to reach groups who may not actually feel included in everything we do. So a holistic approach, I would say. And, you know, when we've got COVID so much in mind, we know that the evidence that we need to do more and do better is there in that Public Health England report as well. So multiple approaches, and possibly, Stephen, something that we can return to, you know, for a separate and more in-depth discussion to show that
having a seminar in November, specifically
really taking shape. Yes. Does Rachel want to add just a quick word on how we pull in our lay members, and they're actually volunteering to help our medical revalidation as well. Feedback to all our medics.
Yes, that's right. We have quite an active group of lay members and regular interaction with them, so we do very much get their views and insights on a very regular basis.
Okay, so I think we'll call that agenda item completed for now. But I think, June, you know, really grateful thanks to you and the rest of the team. I think this report demonstrates the breadth of the things that we're dealing with as an agency, and importantly, there's a lot of the business as usual items. It's not just about COVID, it's not just about Brexit or Cumberledge, it's also about the day-to-day management of every other product, medical product that's on the market here in the UK. So a lot of work, but I think we gratefully you know, will receive your report.
It's a team effort. Thank you.
So, following the theme though, I think actually the next item around healthcare access is around what is the assurance that the MHRA can regulate multiple COVID vaccine applications in parallel with priority, rigour and independence. So Sam Atkinson, our Chief Quality and Access Officer, you can assume the paper's been read, Sam, but are there any key points you'd like us to highlight, and then we can go to questions?
Thank you very much, Chairman. As you've said, the question there was laid out and very clear, and certainly in the paper we've been trying to answer that question. And the paper, as you'll see, is split into 4 key areas, looking at early engagement and scientific rigour, independence, capacity, and then patient and public safety. I thought it was quite important to pull these out in the different areas, partly because the question asked for that, but I think it really does reflect the move to looking at very specific key priorities for the organisation. But 3 considerations I think I probably want to pull out, and all of this is in the backdrop and with public and patient health and wellbeing being at the centre of all of our efforts. But the 3 areas that I really wanted to pick out from the paper was that the regulatory process is potentially quite complicated going forwards with the end of the transition period, and so we must be prepared for all eventualities. It's certainly worth considering the fact that in all cases, wherever we end up, then a vaccine would not be deployed in the UK until it's demonstrated safety, quality and effectiveness through a robust clinical trial programme. Normally our data on vaccines would come in, it would be required to be submitted together at the start of the evaluation of the formal marketing authorisation application. But what we're putting in place to really manage this is a rolling review where tranches of data are submitted when they're ready for regulatory review and before the entire data package is assembled by the company. So by doing this, we're able to really push forward a lot more quickly and look at the data in a more expedited way. It is worth noting, though, that the actual time needed for each assessment will, of course, depend on the quantity and quality of the data submitted. But I think from a licensing perspective and the assessment point of view, we absolutely are ready to take that forward. And the rolling review really enables to look at more than one application at a time. The second area I just wanted to pull out was the independence of the agency's regulatory decisions, and really to point out this is absolutely vital. The government established the Vaccines Task Force back in April. Since then, we've been providing quite a lot of support and guidance,
But as the clinical trials moved forward and the data was due to be submitted into the organisation, then we were concerned, obviously, about potential for conflict of interest. And in September, as you'll see in the paper, we formally withdrew from the vaccines task force, but obviously still providing any support as required through actually a specific mailbox, but also with very key contacts to ensure very prompt responses to any questions that come through. And indeed, we are working quite closely as needed on deployment efforts, which obviously is the big area of work at the moment in the system. The third area is, for me, the positive work ongoing with communication, and I think it was touched on earlier, the International Coalition of Medicines Regulatory Authorities group is also looking at this, trying to share experiences around hesitancy and how to build a robust communication package that demonstrates that the regulatory processes are effective, and also to build that confidence in the products coming through. We're emphasising the key message that fast-tracked or expedited doesn't mean compromising on the assessment process, and indeed or the safety, quality or effectiveness. So it's really about making sure the messages are clear and transparent in terms of what the regulatory process is. One of the other things I just wanted to flag actually is that there is a fantastic podcast. This isn't in the paper, but the government has actually put this on, and the head of the Vaccines Task Force is actually on that particular podcast quite regularly, giving a very detailed account of the current situation with all the vaccines. So something which certainly our members of the public might be interested in. So I think looking at all of the different areas across the paper, I think it is worth saying that we have adapted. We're being very agile. There's a lot of parallel working going. There's a lot of robust prioritisation. I think we certainly stand ready to act and deliver in support of the COVID response. So, Chair, maybe I'll leave it there and perhaps pause for questions if that's okay. But hopefully that's given a reasonable summary of the paper.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. I think the your last sentence around, as you just said, standing ready to act and deliver in the support of the wider fight against COVID-19 demonstrates the agency's crucial role in this. Let's be honest. But we're only one part of the system. But we need to do our part, and I think that's very, very important. And I think around the area of public trust, you particularly were highlighting then, by prioritising work and doing work in parallel is not about compromising standards. So we need to be able to find the mechanism to enable public trust to be maintained, that these vaccine applications will have been assessed appropriately and in depth, and therefore they can be confident in them. That's very, very important, I think. So, colleagues, the question was, what is the assurance? Can I ask if our colleagues are assured? David. Mute, David.
So sorry, Stephen. You'll get fed up with me soon. No, sorry. Yeah, I am both assured and reassured. I thought it was a very nice report from Sam. I think it addresses all those key points about keeping patients on board, patient safety, and moving forward with vaccine development and supporting vaccine development. I have just one question for Sam. So as I understand it, it's the UK's official medicines control laboratory that puts out the authorised batch release for new vaccines. And there was a statement at the end of that section about further communication to highlight the need for this activity with manufacturers who may be approaching authorisation. And it just made me wonder whether only a few have actually made that contact with MHRA, because it would be clearly crucial that that happens.
Should I respond to that, Chair?
Should Christian help?
I'm sure Christian will help. We've certainly been quite proactive in communicating with them, but there is obviously further work that we could always do, and then there may be a further update since the paper was written, and perhaps Christian can comment on that.
Okay, Christian.
Thanks, Chair. Well, indeed, I can confirm that NIBSD has been in close contact with manufacturers from early on. Close contact being defined as we have been discussing what technology transfer would be needed. Obviously, for batch release, this is a European-wide effort. So some companies may not have approached NIPSC, but other countries in the European system, and we are preparing, obviously, for the situation after having left the European Union from 1st of January. So colleagues are up to speed with this. We have issued communications with companies. We have approached them where companies have not engaged with us. We have engaged. And we will continue to do so in order to be prepared. So batch release is not going to be a problem in this.
I think this is a very good example, David, where the agency has been proactive. We're not waiting for the application to come in. We're preparing for the batch release, which is going to be critical to any sort of mass immunisation programme in advance of applications coming in. So again, I think thanks to the team for that. Were there any other questions? Anthony?
I am sure, but I'd like to just pick up the bit about transparency, Sam, because you talked about transparency in the process of regulation. And one of my concerns, obviously, given my background, is the communication and patient information going forward. We all know the debates that are happening and the anti-vax communications on the internet. I think it's going to be really critical around the transparency in data, side effects, and explanations around that, because we've seen the previously complicated patient information leaflets don't really help. So although I'm assured where we are so far, I think we need to also look at this part of the process that we've talked about in the past. And June, we talked in detail about how we might revamp this. It seems to me this is a critical time for this, because what we put out and how it's utilised by other groups can be a challenge. Whether we want to be encouraging companies as well, Stephen, in their transparency of data, so the commercial and confidence aspects of their data. I know you can't answer that now in detail, but I want to raise it as something that I'm still feeling slightly concerned about. Yeah.
Sam, any initial thoughts on how we will communicate how the decisions have been made?
Well, certainly there are.
It's not how the decisions have been made, it's the actual decision and the side effects, not the how bit.
I think the how is important in terms of actually that's how the decision was reached on an individual product. So
yeah, I agree, but I'm happy with that. I've seen that. I can see that from the work that Sam's done. It's the bit after that that's the bit that concerns me.
Okay, Sam?
So as it says in the paper, then obviously the benefits and risks and the reasons why, any positive recommendations there. But I think you're right, Antonio, that it's the next bit that's not covered in the paper, which potentially needs some thinking about, and perhaps comes through in some of the work in response to the Cumberledge review, and also the patient and public engagement activities that Rachel's team are doing. So possibly one for us to pick up outside of this to see where we could enhance this particular area of work. I don't know if June or perhaps Rachel want to comment, Chair.
June, is there anything else you want to add to that?
Well, certainly we were very interested that the US had their first public advisory on this, not to look at specific vaccines, but to get the issues out there, and that was on the 22nd. And I think, as Sam is saying, we should be quite ambitious here, because trust is vital. And working with Public Health England at the moment and DHSC to actually look at how we can, when the time comes, be absolutely transparent. But work in progress, as Sam is saying.
Okay. Mandy.
Yes, it's really a very good paper again, Sam. Thank you for that. I think I would just want to emphasise that importance of our transparency and independence, which is some of the questions that are coming through. So in terms of where we're working internationally, understanding how that data is being shared, and how we're working with different, because companies are global, in terms of how we're sharing that data. And also when it comes to inspection and the integrity, we touched on batch release, the resources to inspect overseas as well, because a lot of vaccine manufacturing could be abroad, and understanding those different standards. So understanding the integrity of vaccine manufacture, but also about the data and how that's sharing. I know these are difficult things to communicate, but what are the thoughts at the moment on how that will be done?
So just coming back on some of that, I mean, internationally, as we mentioned before, there's an awful lot of work ongoing already, and the group, the International Coalition group that we've been referring to, are doing an awful lot in terms of sharing information on inspections, equally on pharmacovigilance. There's a whole range of different things. So from a regulatory authority point of view, there's a lot of harmonisation, sharing, exchange of learnings. That's absolutely building a richness into those conversations and actually making them much more robust. But to talk about specifically, for example, inspections, one of the areas we're looking at is what we can do from a remote perspective, both nationally and internationally. So how can we use digital inspections to greater effect? How can we use I guess, other technologies, but equally, how can we rely on others? So there's that mutual recognition element as well. And so there's quite a lot of assessments ongoing at the moment in terms of looking at different regulatory approaches, whether they're as robust as ours, what we would accept, what we wouldn't. So that there's a range of different things happening to give us that assurance, and to then move forward. Obviously, we can then do the transparency element, but I guess we need to understand what's out there at the moment and what's happening, and really take this opportunity, in a sense, of the pandemic to actually change the way we work in a much better way, that perhaps can be taken forward in the long run and reduce that burden on industry while still providing the same level of rigour, I guess, in terms of the activities that we undertake. Does that sort of answer your question, Amanda? Is there further?
Yes, I think that's reassuring to know. I think it's really understanding, and those questions that can come back at a national level around what we're doing and how we're assuring. So I think that then links to the communication and the transparency around that. So where data's come from, where we've relied on things externally and internally.
Absolutely, and we're building a framework around some of these things as well, so it will be a lot easier to describe, I guess, is probably the best way to put it. Thank you, Chair.
Okay. So thank you, Sam. Were there any other questions on this specific item? So Rachel, do you have a question from the public?
We do, yes. We have several questions from members of the public on this paper. So perhaps if I just pick those ones up, if that's okay. We have a question on the duration of immunity from the natural COVID-19 disease, and the questioner is saying that if this is still an unknown, how can the public be assured about the longevity of immunity from the vaccine?
That's a difficult question when we haven't actually got the data in front of us, I guess. But,
Indeed.
Yeah, June, do you want to just make a comment on that? Because obviously this is partly dependent on individual products, and we're not in a position to talk about individual products right now.
And I think Christian might want to come in on the science. It's a matter I would expect our expert group led by Munir Mohammed to be looking at. His role is on benefit risk of the vaccine as the data packages that Sam's described come through. And that is the, if you like, the background context to the deployment that will need to be understood. After all, we know that flu vaccines need to be looked at every year, for example, in terms of the strains. So, and I know that Professor Bannister probably has huge knowledge at her fingertips. Can I hand it to Christian on anything Christian would like to add?
Christian, I suppose it's just the principle of what would the, what sort of data would we need to provide the confidence to answer that question, in more general terms and specifics.
Thank you indeed. So as a general answer, obviously we are aware of this and we will be looking into this. So there needs to be a concept in my mind on how to look at this, but we shouldn't forget that vaccines are different to the natural pathogen of a disease. So vaccines can possibly induce a very long-lasting immune response. We don't know that. Obviously, it's very natural that we don't know yet because we haven't seen the data yet in its early days, inherently so. But I'm not sure if the if the comparison to the natural disease is the right comparison. It's the same as with vaccines that we know for other diseases where the immune response can be very long lasting, but obviously we don't know this. So to make a long answer short, we will be looking at this. It's an important question, obviously.
Yeah, good. Okay. There may be other questions, Rachel, but can we maybe pick those up later, if that's okay? But I think in summary, coming back to the question on the agenda, which is what is the assurance that the MHRA can regulate the multiple applications with priority, rigour and independence. I think what I heard from colleagues was that we are assured so far, but I think there's an important action that comes out of Anthony's point around the looking in more detail at the transparent patient communications after the approval, because we do need to think about how we communicate this in a way that provides the trust that the public, quite frankly, demand, and rightly so as well. So I think there's some more work around the communications after the event in terms of how we've reached the decisions, but more importantly, what risks, benefits, etc. So patient communications, Sam, I think will be the key action from that particular item. Okay. The second item under healthcare access today was about what is the assurance that the MHRA will be ready to operate on day one of EU transition. As I said earlier, a matter of 66 days ago, 66 days away. So John Fundry, do you want to take us through what assurance we can have on the next paper, please?
Thanks, Stephen, and thanks also for the helpful reminder on 66 days. The programme team do have a clock, I think, ticking away on their desktops. So I won't go through all the material that's in the paper, but perhaps highlight a few things and also just draw the board's attention to some of the things actually that have literally changed in the last few days. As we're all aware, the negotiations are still ongoing and some items, as I say, have changed in the last couple of weeks since we actually developed the paper. First of all, I think one of the points worth bringing out, as the board is aware, we were developing systems contingency in the event of a no deal for 18 months, 2 years under John Quinn's leadership. That system was developed very successfully. That forms the platform for the systems that we're going to use from the 1st of January onwards. And because of the number of cliff edges we had around no deal, actually those systems were made live and customers registered for them a number of times in the run-up to the agreement on the transition period. So we know they operate and that puts us in a good place. The paper refers to the guidance we've issued and the programme of webinars that Rachel and the team, together with all the operational colleagues, are leading on at the moment. We had the first set of 5 of the 9 currently planned last week, and Rachel was telling us earlier today actually that 8,000 people attended those webinars. So an indication of the level of demand out there. Unfortunately, we're giving away the webinars free, but if we were charging for them, it could well help allay David's concerns around NIBS funding. But anyway, just to reassure the public, we will be continuing to provide the webinars free. I don't want any red top headlines in the aftermath of this. Industry concerns, I think, continue to be around FMD, the Fake Medicines Directive, how that will actually implement in practice. And that's a key area of concern for them. The definition of what is a trader, how that will operate, etc. The bit that has changed in the last couple of weeks is around access to databases. That's flagged in the paper as a risk. Last Wednesday, we heard some good news, which they've agreed to give us, the EU agreed to give us access to some databases, notably CESP, the Common Submission Portal. That's very helpful indeed. If we didn't have access to that, industry would be having to submit dossiers, etc. twice. The path for ADRs, adverse drug reactions, notifications would have been more complex and more onerous. So not only CESP, but potentially other databases. So the team are at the moment evaluating what that means in practice and mapping out those databases to our operational requirements. So potentially some good news in terms of mitigating one of the key risks that the project faces. I think the only other point to mention, as referred to in the report, is the programme has been subject to independent assurance. Those of us that work in the public sector will know that the IPA, the Infrastructure Projects Authority, for a long time has been assessing major government programmes. They were in to look at us 2 weeks ago. They've given us an overall rating of amber, which is by no means unusual. That's our own assessment at this stage of the programme. They've highlighted a few areas for us to look at, but they've also acknowledged the shed load of effort that the programme team and operational teams have put in place, I think, to get us to this position. And I think it's also worth acknowledging the effort from our legal colleagues. There was a phenomenal amount of effort required to get the various statutory instruments in place that were actually laid earlier this month. And there's a significant amount of midnight and weekend oil, I think, has been burnt getting those in place. So our thanks to our legal colleagues on that. I think those are the main points that I wanted to highlight. Happy to open it up to wider questions.
Okay, thank you, John. I think I'd just like to underline our thanks actually to Elizabeth and Neil and the government legal team for all of their work on the SIs. I think I'd like to record in the minutes that we're very, very grateful for a huge amount of work. This whole programme has been a massive team effort, but actually that was a vitally important component to get the necessary components into law. So thank you, Elizabeth and the team, and please pass on our thanks. I think also when we're looking at a paper like this, we should also just remember why we're doing this. And fundamentally, the whole underlying objective for doing this is to ensure that patients in all parts of the UK will continue to have access to existing and new medicines and devices for their healthcare needs from the 1st of January. So we must not forget the reason that we're doing this. This is not just having a project for the sake of it. This is a very, very real situation. And actually, I think from everything that we've seen, that's exactly what we're working towards. Now, I know the colleagues might have some questions to ask, but could I just come to Chris Garland? Chris, you're obviously, our principal pharmaceutical officer in Northern Ireland. Just from what you've seen from this paper, can I just ask if there are any comments from the devolved administration that's probably most crucially affected by some of these arrangements?
Thanks, Stephen. And I think from our perspective, very, very reassured to see the wide range of planning the MHRA colleagues have undertaken in order to maintain the continuity of medicine supply to our people in Northern Ireland. We're continuing to work very closely with the agency as well as the HSC colleagues to work through these measures. So certainly the paper very, very helpful and provides us with a high degree of assurance. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say, Chris, we'll continue to work with you on this. This is vitally important for patients in Northern Ireland and elsewhere. There's a few people putting their hands up, but can I just come to John Quinn first? John, I think just to further add on to the paper.
Thank you, Stephen. And it was just an additional piece of assurance, really. So obviously, I think John's outlined the external assurance, but there's quite a bit of internal assurance that gets added into this. In effect, I act as the senior supplier to the programme, providing programme management and delivery resources. So I need to be assured that we're going to deliver this solution. So I think there's independent reviews from IPA. We've now got EPMO doing gateway reviews internally too.
EPMO, describe what EPMO is, John, just quickly.
Thanks, Stephen. The Enterprise Portfolio Management Office, they're the quality team that assesses the health of any programme and have various different stage gates. So I think there's an internal focus, and as we get closer, one of the assurances I think we need to reiterate to the board is that this has the clear path, because we have multiple projects and programmes running at the same time. This has certainly, as we close into the through December, has the priority call on my resources and the change windows. which I think could be added to the assurance pile.
Yeah. So I think there's strong independent assurance, there's the internal independence, and there's clearly internal priorities. So Barbara, I think you were first, and then I'll come to Bruce.
It's a simple question, really, and it's in the face of changing information in the media and to ourselves as we rush towards Brexit, and that is, you mentioned standstills, both in general and for the Northern Ireland arrangements. Would you like to say a bit more about what stands still and whether this will change?
John, can you answer that?
So I don't think there are any plans to change those standstill arrangements, certainly that I'm aware of, and I don't think it's a matter of negotiations. So I think that's not a risk.
Does Barbara mean what will be standing still?
Oh, in terms of our approach to regulation, etc., yes, for the period of a couple of years, and then I believe 4 years for the Northern Ireland protocol.
So existing regulations will still apply effectively in terms of standards, even though there's obviously new legislation being put in place.
So it's just a pause, really.
In terms of the standards that companies, because companies have been very clear to us actually for the last few months, they can't physically change their labels now before the 1st of January. It's impossible.
Yep.
So with a long supply chain, so therefore we can't be in a position where every pharmaceutical product will be illegal effectively. So the standstill important is a very important pragmatic approach to make sure that patients in Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK can continue to receive the medicines that they need from the 1st of January. But obviously new regulations will be put in place in due course. Bruce, can I come to you?
Yes, I just wanted to ask, the paper says, quote, there are real concerns on the part of industry about the Falsified Medicines Directive and the supply from GB into Northern Ireland. And I didn't understand that. What precisely is it about the Falsified Medicines Directive and what is the risk?
Okay, John.
So it's really the clarity around how the arrangements will operate. So goods which come from Great Britain to Northern Ireland will need to apply FMD, the Fake Medicines Directive. Now, the concerns of industry are that if they're going to have to do that in 2 different types, they will need time to prepare. And they're saying 12 to 18 months minimum, perhaps more. And because, if you like, the discussions are still ongoing, the definitions of, for example, what is a Northern Ireland trader and what are the responsibilities of a GB market authorization holder are still unclear. And in the lack of that clarity, that's a concern for industry.
So clearly some of the political discussions are still ongoing, Bruce, and I think we're obviously trying our very best to respond as quickly as we can. We try to provide certainty where we can to industry, and there was a call just on Friday, with all the major trade associations involved. And so it's an ongoing dialogue at the moment. So I think some of the practical concerns are well understood. All the answers are not yet determined, but we're working as hard as we can. As soon as political decisions are made, we'll be able to respond very quickly. So, Michael.
Yeah, sorry, again, just a very quick question, John. Very impressive paper, and I am assured by everything I hear. The only question I've got is, and it's the legal one, it says there that the statutory instruments have been laid, and I know that's been a tremendous effort, well done to everybody, but there may need to be subsequent statutory instruments post-Brexit, post the 1st of January. I've seen programs before and there's some inevitability around that, but is that because of there is still uncertainty as to how it will all play out in practice, and that's probably to be understood? Or is it just a more routine thing that we've got through everything that we need to go through to get to the 1st of January, and there'll be some mopping up required post-January? I think that's important for me because I suspect as a board member, I just want to be absolutely certain that from a legal perspective, we cannot be challenged in any way around some of the decisions that we might have to make. I'm not a lawyer and I may be misinterpreting what I'm hearing there, but I'd just like a little bit more background as to why we may need subsequent statutory instruments post 1st of January.
John, is there a quick summary on that?
Yeah, happy to cover that. So one for the boring administrative things, which is there may be some inconsistencies that we need to clear up in the SIs, and that would be an opportunity to do so. The anticipation, the plan is that those SIs that the paper talks about, the intention is that they would not be concerning the January 21 situation, but would be more about what happens at the end of the 2 years standstill or the 4 years of the Northern Ireland Protocol. So if you like, they're the next phase of the project after the January. So January 21, we should be clear to operate. The question is, what's the next evolution as the negotiations continue?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Mandy, I think you had your hand up.
Yes, so it's just really going back to the FMD, the Falsified Medicines Directive. In terms of communication around that, what assurance can we give in our communications that the integrity of medicines will be the same or equal to what it is now? I think there's quite a lot of jargon with FMD. I understand where industry are coming from with their packaging and their traceability, but I think it's important in terms of our communication more broadly around assurance of the integrity of medicines and how we're going to do that.
John, do you want to pick that up, or do I need to pass it to somebody else?
I think Rachel might be able to cover it because I think it's covered during the webinar programs, actually.
Yeah. Rachel, can you just provide some more detail?
Sorry, yes, that's right. It is covered in the webinar program, and we're planning some wider comms on it quite shortly.
So I think the point is we maybe haven't got the time to go into the detail of the what now, Mandy, but I think this topic is clearly understood and is already in train of being communicated to the relevant parties, I think is what I heard from that.
Okay, that's fine.
So were there any other questions from colleagues? Could I just ask Rachel if there were any specific questions from members of the public on this topic?
Yes, thank you. There's a specific set of questions actually from one of the patient groups that relate to patient and public involvement and patient expert evidence being included in new licensing processes post-transition. For example, will patient experts be entitled to attend meetings regarding licensing? At what stage will patient experts be included in the licensing process, and how the processes will differ from the current EMA process? So a number of questions there, including whether the EMA will still have influence over licensing decisions in the UK.
Okay, so obviously that's a little beyond just the day one readiness, but June, obviously still in progress. We haven't determined yet what the new regulatory process will be, but could you maybe just highlight some of the key principles that would maybe help to provide some assurance to the questioner?
Yes, we're working hard on our innovative licensing process to ensure that the patient perspective and views is integrated throughout. And how we're doing it at the moment, having had a soft launch, if you like, in September, is to undertake pilots. And that will make it a little bit easier once we've got some products that are actually going through that process. So there are 4 that have kicked off, and we're looking forward very much to an iterative learning as those move through to see how we can intensify and perhaps even work, because it's very much a partnership process with bodies like NICE. So we wouldn't want any particular patient perspective to feel stretched in different directions. If we can bring things together, then that will enable the maximal benefit of that. I think quickly the second question was about, will EMA influence? Certainly that during the standstill we'll be reflecting for medicines, automatically recognising, if you like, as far as we may, and adapting to the UK healthcare delivery and culture. So that will be very much an ongoing consistency, which I think will help patients feel very confident, and that influence is there. After all, we've been very pleased over many years to be a strong voice in the EU system and have had a hand in shaping how it works. So that ongoing consistency, compatibility, and if you like, impact of EU decision making is something that will feature.
Okay, thank you, June. I think that's helpful. So I think as far as this particular agenda item is concerned, the question was, what's the assurance that we'll be ready to operate on day one of EU transition? And what I've heard is that there is assurance that we'll be ready, and that's come from independent and internal sources. But that's only the start of the journey. And I think the point that June was just making there was actually over the next during the standstill period of 2 years, we need to develop a new system. In reality, it's not 2 years, because actually, we have to allow industry time to be able to make the appropriate changes. So really the hard work on new regulatory systems for medicines and devices is going to be done in the next 6 to 9 months in reality. And so this is a topic that we will come back to as a board, and there will be opportunities for patient and public involvement in some of those discussions, I'm sure. So I think it's still a work in progress, is what the future state will be. But the more immediate need is it's the 66 days time. Will we be able to continue to enable patients to have access to new and existing medicines on January the 1st? And the answer is, from an agency point of view, we expect to be ready and intend to be ready with all the work that's been going on. So thank you to colleagues for the work that's been done. And I think on that basis, I'd like to move on to the next topic, which is patient safety. So a number of these things are clearly interrelated. But obviously earlier in the year, there was the recommendations from the Cumberledge Review. And so, June, a number of those, there's a whole wide-ranging set of recommendations, but specifically the ones for the agency. Can you just give us some update, please, on what actions that we're taking to address those?
Of course, and it might be worth framing our discussion by first of all saying loud and clear how seriously the agency treated the publication, the recommendations of the Independent Medicines and Medical Devices Review, published, as you say, Stephen, back in July. And I really would like to highlight that we recognise that patient safety must continually be protected. And many of the major changes highlighted in the report can't wait. We need to be moving. And so we're making changes where we can without delay, particularly to ensure we're listening to patients appropriately and involving patients in all aspects of our work. And I'll say a little bit more how we're doing that in a moment. Of course, we're working closely with other system partners to make sure that the efforts that we make are going to have the maximal impact because of that system-wide approach. And therefore, we're working closely with our DHSC colleagues who are coordinating the government's response. But as I say, there's no need to wait when things are quite clearly needing to change. And I just would like to remind everyone of what recommendation 6 of the 9 directs to us. The MHRA needs substantial revision in relation to adverse event reporting, medical device regulation. It needs to ensure it engages more with patients and their outcomes. It needs to raise awareness of public protection roles and ensure that patients have an integral role in our work. So, all of that has been starting, but then there are going to be a wide, far-reaching set of changes, particularly as you've just said, around the clear legal frameworks on safety decision-making should be involving patients systematically, and particularly in the area of medical device regulation. As we know, it's very much in the spotlight, but we need to overhaul adverse event reporting, and that was the word that was used, to recognise the contributions of those who share their experiences with them and make sure they feature in the analysis and the decision making. It isn't just thanks and over and out. And then identifying particularly those medicines that have adverse effects on the growing fetus, the baby in the womb, that are used in pregnancy. But last but not least is this protocol for prompt system-wide coordinated response. So what are we doing? And we're doing three things. We're developing our capacity to listen and respond to patients. We're building a responsive reporting system, and we're looking to create better evidence on which to take patient safety decisions. I think it was one of the hardest hitting phrases in the report that we are flying blind in so many areas, and that needs to change. So we've talked already, and I think quite rightly, on patient and public engagement, but that means a cultural change so that every member of our staff thinks about the patient perspective in every decision. And every team needs to be able to systematically involve patients, and that's something that we're thinking hard about, and it will feed into our business planning. And that will also be linked with reaching under-involved or under-reached groups. The design and delivery of our services, I think, has already come up in our discussion to ensure they meet the needs of patients and others. It's the whole reason for our existence, and to ensure that all activity is underpinned by patient-focused communications. And just one example about when we say all activities will reflect the patient view, what do we mean? Patient-reported outcomes, really interesting and important area to systematically look at as we license or approve new products. So we've got a special interest group to look at how well researched patient-reported outcomes are, to expand on the knowledge in the agency, and how good quality patient-reported outcomes can be used and will impact on our work. In terms of the responsive safety system, it's very exciting that our new plans for an IT programme of work, Safety Connect, moving forward, it's had a boost because we know for the COVID deployment we'll need it, and therefore we want to be able to detect issues with any medicine or device or blood product much more quickly than we've done in the past, and to use all available technology to help us to do that, and to make sure that patient involvement in Safety Connect design has been built in from the outset, and there's been some really good workshops. So a lot's happening in that space, and I hope that very much it will show how much we will see, as we saw during the Village review, that the amount of information patients and the public share with us is truly vital to our safety monitoring. And then last but not least, the better evidence. That may well be progressing to a slightly slower time frame, but nonetheless, it's well on its way, starting with devices and the focus on mesh, the mesh for stress urinary incontinence and pelvic organ prolapse. Although there's a pause depending on when criteria and conditions for use will be met, we're already looking to a much better informed and evidence base for decisions with our mesh registry. So a huge amount of work led by DHSC, but we're also inputting by NHS Digital. And we're working on a valproate registry too. The aim is to get it up and running before the end of the year, to be able to see that women on valproate and any babies that are born are properly monitored and followed up. And that should be extended to any medicine for epilepsy. We've got an expert group looking at the data that exists in pockets in databases around the UK, particularly those that monitor birth defects. And so we can look at what medicine a woman has had during pregnancy and the outcomes of that pregnancy, and really connect much better what already exists and use it to the full. Haven't mentioned the need for legal change. A lot of this can happen as we would do naturally in a scientifically based organisation, but the bill that's working its way through Parliament at the moment is going to be tremendously important to be able to build in provisions in this area. So overall, things are happening. I think the first thing we hope will be patients feeling the difference involved in safety issues as we assess them. And there's one particular one that we'll talk about later, perhaps, the isotretinoin. And then perhaps to a slightly slower takeoff, Safety Connect, which will be testing and piloting later in the year. And then in terms of better evidence, more likely it will be throughout the course of next year that we'll be able to connect with registries and have this real world picture of what is happening if you have a device implanted or if you're taking a medicine long term for a serious and important condition like epilepsy or a mental health issue. So it's a long programme, but the benefits will start to be in place soon. And overall, our commitment is to work with our system partners. We're not in isolation on turning this around, and to work closely as the government considers its formal response. I'll stop there, Stephen, and really hope to open out for discussion now.
Right, well, thank you very much, June. I'm really pleased that you responded to my challenge, because I think previous papers have tended to talk about we're going to develop a plan. And actually, I was very keen to get much more specific examples of things we're actually going to do and things that we are doing. Because in reality, there's a lot of different activities across the agency. So I think this paper actually makes it much more tangible from my perspective. So thank you for responding to the challenge. So Bruce, do you want to start us off?
Yes, I mean, really following up what you said, I'd like to make really a couple of points. That the whole business of patient engagement, everything I'm hearing as a board member is reassuring, it's reasonable and so forth. But it's not really giving me any tangible evidence of how patient involvement is influencing decisions, how it's contributing. And I think that as a board member, I would like very much more just examples in the various ways in which patients, the public, are being engaged. How are those helpful? And I go on a little bit further to ask, is the agency, if you like, auditing and studying that scientifically? Because when we did this at NICE, starting to introduce patient input into the programs that I chaired, we very much tried to look back and, in a sense, study it scientifically. So we could say, look, what kind of input has been most helpful? How has it influenced our decision making? And we published that in the scientific literature. And I think that doing things in that way would, number one, externalize what we're doing, quite apart from internally helping our learning and our evolution. I think it could increase public trust. And I think, you know, at the end of the day, actually producing written evidence of what we've done, how it's helped, can do nothing but help us evolve and help to build public trust. So that's a selection of comments, but what's actually happening is so important.
Good, and examples that speak to what you've said, Bruce, really importantly, are needed. But let me say there are three areas. The patient's perspective on the nature, the magnitude of the risk, and the patient's view on how that risk is minimised, because there's a burden that attaches, and perhaps it's not the best word, but very often, you know, it's have you read, have you understood, have you signed a risk acknowledgement with your neurologist if it's valproate, that sort of thing, and how we monitor whether that has had an impact. And I think the valproate, which is very much in mind at the moment, can help with that. It's valproate women, mothers, families that told us the nature of the risk, which our systems hadn't fully understood of neurodevelopmental disorder. Patients told us what was acceptable and not, and guided us on how that risk should be communicated. And it was an incredible exercise where we tested a pictogram and said, oh no, but it was the mothers and families who said, oh yes, and now it is on the packs. The typical then, and you know, big question is, did it make a difference? We're seeing a very slow impact, although depends how you weigh this. The number of affected babies, our estimate, has halved in the last 2 years. How you would link that again directly is a matter that would need very careful consideration. And I think your challenge is, do we write it up and so forth? Well, it has changed practice. It has definitely changed practice. So it's the patient's perspective, and we'll talk about isotretinoin, I know, which will tell us, is this risk acceptable and how should it be managed? And then measuring if it has an impact through using CPRD, studies done by independent researchers. We need to connect this all up. But it's absolutely vital. But I have no doubt whatever, we have to go this road.
Yeah. You see, I think actually Bruce makes a good point, isn't it, about trying to make this systematic and not just on one topic, but systematic across our range of possibilities. And I think that actually is going to be very helpful. And Anthony, I know you were next, and then I'll come to David.
Thank you. I wanted to, first of all, I want to congratulate you on the uptake in the yellow card reporting following the patient safety day. I think that was really good. But that then leads me on to an area that I'm looking for a bit more assurance from. I can see Safety Connect, and I can see the areas of development in points 21 through to 23. You'll know from my previous comments, one of the things that concerns me is we get this increase of patient reporting, and then we're not perhaps managing the responses effectively. And I noted this there was in point 23, there's something saying user-centric feedback. Is that where we're looking into how, when people do join in this system and how they are engaging, that they can get appropriate responses and they can follow the progress of an issue? Is that what that's about, John? I can see you're waving a pen.
John will come in there, but this is the big change, isn't it? It's moving from, we've got your report over and out, to dialogue, and that is going to be needing all the IT and clever systems that we can manage. John.
Thank you. It's a really good question, and we'll need to think of how we describe that a bit better, I think, going forward. Government as a whole has something called service design, and this is a requirement of every government agency to design services around its users. So back to that point, they are in the room with you designing that service, and it's no longer linear. I mean, we're pretty clear on that. The early mapping that we've done says here is, there is a feedback loop associated with that process. So the principles and standards of government service design, which we will apply, has that embedded within that process. So absolutely, our expectation is there'll be that feedback loop and ways to engage. And one of the really exciting and interesting things is that there is potential, notwithstanding we need to look at data and data protection, of connecting people together to provide a platform of communities. So there's more work to do on that. We are still in the process of engaging with the marketplace, but when it comes to breaking soil and starting to develop the services, it's not done in the old way. It's done in a way where you're designing, testing, building those services, and that feedback loop is fundamentally already captured as a requirement. So yes, I think, Anthony.
Okay, yeah, and I think that's really important, John, because I think what we need to do with our IT systems is bring data from multiple sources, and patients are clearly going to be an important one, but that's not the only source of data. Registries, the NHS, as well as our other sort of vigilance systems internally as well. So we need something that's much more encompassing than actually what we've currently had in the past. And so, was that a question, or are you agreeing, John?
I was. I think there's a principle to play here. The public should not need to know the organogram of government. So we need to be in the place where they are, where they want to raise signals, where they want to meet with others, and make it easy up for them to behave in the way that's natural to them. That's a principle in our design, and I hope that will come through when we start developing.
Yeah, I completely agree with that.
Could I just follow up on that, Stephen?
Because I'd like to move on to
very quick one. So given that we had those extra thousands of reports from the yellow card, are we going to make sure that we respond to those, although we haven't got the system yet, that we can get the appropriate response to all those individuals? Because otherwise we're going to see ourselves being challenged again in that area. And a quick yes or no that you've got it in hand will be, Rachel, I guess.
Is that a yes or a no, Rachel?
Yes, it's a yes.
It's a yes. Okay. So, David, sorry, you've been very patient.
No, that's fine. I think I'm unmuted this time as well. So I had sort of a question and then a comment. And the question, it's not strictly for MHRA, but the World Patient Safety Day, I think that probably passes the public by pretty much. And the Medicines Safety Week, similarly. And I just wondered whether MHRA should be working with the wider NHS and with pharmacy services to try and make a bigger thing of these days and these weeks, because they're a fantastic opportunity to get messages out for patients to better understand what we're doing. That's the question. The comment is, whilst of course patient engagement is incredibly important, and I think this paper is very helpful, I personally, and I've said this before, think that MHRA doesn't engage enough with healthcare professionals. I see 150 were met with. I don't know what happened about that. I'd love to know another time. But actually, there's a much broader engagement that's needed with healthcare. Of course, MHRA doesn't have the responsibility for healthcare workers. Medics, they're responsible to their royal colleges and to the GMC, but MHRA should still be talking to them.
June, any reflections on that?
Two really important points there. The World Patient Safety Day, I think we did engage with, and Rachel will talk about that. I'm at the WHO this week talking about valproate to reach as many people as possible through their essential medicines list. And I think we've just got to keep on keeping on using every possible, and in fact it was the patients that unilaterally went to the World Health Organization to make sure we can disseminate. We know a lot about valproate through the systems we have. There are pockets of practice in the world that are totally uninformed. So we've got to have, through our international office and other outreach, ways of getting those messages.
This wasn't about valproate. This was about...
No, I know, but that's an example of how we can do it. And for World Patient Safety Day, I think we had a kind of virtual campaign. Rachel, do you want to mention that? We joined in. We certainly did. Had our share of the spotlight.
Yes, that's right. And it's Patient Safety Week next week, so there's a lot of activity planned, both ourselves and with other partners across the system, as indeed is being planned globally as well. And just to say, we'll particularly be promoting yellow cards during that Patient Safety Week next week. And if I may, if I could just pick up David's point about healthcare professional engagement, we've just started work on a broader healthcare professionals engagement strategy, which will be coming through to the board in due course.
I think that will be helpful actually, because I think we do need to come back to this, because I particularly am taken with Bruce's comment around systematic patient involvement and something that's actually real and meaningful and not superficial in any way. And I think it's actually sort of a broader topic that probably deserves more conversation, if I'm completely honest. But I think actually, just before we move on, actually, Rachel, were there any other comments from members of the public on this particular item? Or could we pick those up in the Q&A session?
Yeah, I mean, you may want to pick them up in the Q&A session, okay. Chairman.
Okay, Sam, would you like the last question?
Oh, thank you. Sorry, I wasn't sure if you could see me or not. So it wasn't really a question. It was really just a comment just on the last topic in relation to communication and engagement with healthcare professionals. On reflection of dealing with things like COVID and other incidents, actually they're a really good way to actually start some of those engagements. And we probably need to really build on what we've learned, and actually some of the relationships we've built over these various different things. And the pandemic is absolutely one where we've created a huge network across the NHS, working through the chief pharmaceutical officers, and that has been really beneficial in terms of trying to talk through some of the challenges the NHS are managing, but equally really helping support some of the flexibilities that have been required. So probably a nice network that we're using, and certainly we've had an engagement package for that network as well that's had a weekly update. So I think it's a starting point, but I agree we could do more. But just a comment, thank you.
Okay, I think the way I'm interpreting this particular item is that there's a huge amount of support for the work of actually doing more around the whole area of patient safety, both from a systematic point of view, but also patient engagement and involvement. So I think there's a lot of support for the work that's been done, June. And I think actually there's almost a demand for more, to be fair. And I think that's probably the easiest way to summarise this particular section. But so thank you for the work that's been done, and thank you for the work that will be done in the future to add to this. So the next item on the agenda is probably a little bit more administrative in some ways, but it's an important component in terms of just bringing us on to the key responsibilities and assurance map for our new unitary board and our various assurance committees and management committees. I think this paper's been drawn up from a number of different sources, and we started off with the guidance from the Cabinet Office on the way that executive agencies should be gaining assurance through their through their structure and their organisation. In addition to that, as you all know, we conducted a governance review with the independent support of Ernst & Young as part of that, so that was also one of the contributory sources. We've clearly had a board seminar last month where we debated some of the the proposals, and then of course the change team through June and Carly and the rest of the executive team have clearly spent a lot of time thinking very carefully and quite deeply around how the management structure of the organisation should be organised to achieve the objectives and deliver the vision that we've got. So I think this paper tries to summarise what is potentially a very dry subject, but is a very, very important subject. And if I just draw your attention to the diagram, which is on page 37 of the board pack, there's a lot of lines and boxes on this, but I think in fundamental terms, I think it demonstrates that the role of the agency leadership, that is fundamentally June's role as chief executive officer. She's also the accounting officer in government terms. And actually she has a direct line of accountability to Parliament, ultimately through the sponsor minister to the Secretary of State, and also to the permanent secretary in the Department of Health and Social Care. In addition to that, of course, June obviously is accountable to the agency board. So June's right in the middle of all of this, a very, very difficult and tough role, trying to manage all the different stakeholders, but actually that's fundamentally where all these different components all come together. As I mentioned in my introduction, the role of the agency board is one of strategic leadership. That's to develop a strategy, it's ensuring we've got good corporate governance and controls in place, and it's about continuing to strive for performance improvement in everything that we do. That comes through constructive challenge and constructive support. And I think to gain assurance, what we've talked about in previous occasions is we've got an audit and risk assurance committee, and I think that's functioning very well. However, we need to add to that, and I think actually adding a patient and safety assurance committee into our assurance mechanism is very important to scrutinise patient safety and also challenge, provide support and challenge on patient engagement and provide assurance to the board. And I think also looking to extend the role of the previous nominations and remuneration committee to extend an internal perspective around the organisational development. How are we coping with our staff capabilities, managing change, challenging our people strategy to actually do more and make this really a great place to work for our staff to help to deliver for patients. So 3 assurance committees, and I've described those as strategic assurance. But the fundamental leadership of the operations of the organisation will come through the executive committee. So that's the chief officers on call today. And then there's the 6 management committees that that the team have put together to basically look across the previous divisional boundaries. I think that's the way I would describe it. This is all about one agency. It's not about this division and that division and the other division. It's trying to bring it together to provide a much more coherent direction to our staff and therefore much better delivery of all the performance of the key criteria we need to achieve. So that, in summary, I think is what it's about. There shouldn't be any surprises on this paper because it's things we've discussed previously, but I want to formally propose it to the board for approval. But before we do that, can I just ask if there are any further comments or reflections or questions on this particular paper? Michael, can we just start with you, please, as the head of our Audit and Risk Assurance Committee? Can you go off mute, please, Michael? And now you're frozen. Still can't hear you, Michael.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Brilliant. Sorry, I'm having a problem with my computer. very much support this paper, and I've seen it various times. It's an observation really that I would make, and it's really just advice for June really as accounting officer. The accounting officer letter of appointment makes very clear that June is also responsible for value for money and the stewardship of the resources within that voted for the MHRA or what it receives from revenue. I just made the comment that you've got 3 committees: resource, risk and audit, performance and delivery. That's fine for cutting across divisional boundaries, but I think it's important that resource decisions are not made in isolation of performance, and performance evaluation is not made in isolation of resource requirements. It relates to a point that David Webb made earlier. If you're looking at NIBS, you need to be looking at both sides of it. It's resource consumption and what it achieves, and is that in appropriate balance? So I would support the structure, and ultimately it's June's decision, but I would emphasize the importance of linkages between these committees, not just at executive committee level, but so, for example, I don't know if John is a member of the Performance and Delivery Committee, or Christian is similarly a member of the Resources Committee. I think that cross-fertilisation of challenge is very important. But that's advice. This is June's area, and as a non-executive, I'm really just giving advice based on my previous experience.
June, do you want to come back on that? Because I should have actually given you the opportunity to comment on the management committee a little more.
It's vital that we have these cross links, and they come to home to roost at the executive level. And as accounting officer, I am only too aware every day of every week of that responsibility, and how controlling the purse strings is, if we're to have a sustainable organisation, is at the heart of what what I do and what executive needs to be. Sources, performance and delivery, and strategic change have really good cross-representation. I'm pleased that at the executive committee level, we're already well advanced beyond the 3 centres, which may have brands, etc., that we want to preserve, but it's a one agency delivery at the moment. And in the interim, I'm giving liftoff to the performance and delivery and strategic change, just so the board knows, this week. And this will strongly feature in the discussions, because none of this should be decided, in these 6 places in isolation, but the 3 that Michael has discussed, resources, performance and delivery, and strategic change, need that underpinning cross-fertilisation. And I'll keep the board informed, if I may, because this is being run in at the moment. It's we gave ourselves the challenge of October to get them all up and running, and you can see this is last week for performance and delivery and strategic change. But if anything comes out of that we think needs rethinking, we will bring this to the board.
Okay,
thank you.
Thank you, June. Anthony, you want to raise a point?
Yeah, it's more, it may be that it's implicit in the paper, but I think it's a really great summary, and with massive improvement for governance and assurance for the organisation. What I'm missing is what happens when something does go wrong. So if there's something significant happens, I can see the groups, but I can't see where we get which items to, say, the Risk and Assurance Committee. And obviously it will depend on what the issue is, which management structure it goes through. But for me, that bit is probably implicit, and we need to make a bit more explicit in it, Stephen. I'm very happy with the system and the organisation. It might be just some dialogue that's put around the communication of this.
Yeah, I think that's a helpful suggestion. June, any reflections from you?
I'm really pleased to have it. I think we stress test, and we should have some scenarios that make sure that nothing falls between cracks. I mean, when you take a unifying approach, as this is, from the board downwards, we've just got to be absolutely sure that nothing has, there are no gaps. And the only way to be sure of that is a financial risk, a public safety risk, etc., legal or other, reputational. Do they find their way to the right level for the right decision to be made at the right time? And I'll take that one away with my exec colleagues and start thinking stress tests.
Yeah, and that could be as much as going to some of our business continuity issues, to some emergency response situations. But we've got a whole wealth of experience of dealing with COVID. And that's actually brought a whole range of new approaches to the way that we're actually dealing with that really important situation, at pace. And so I think we can probably bring a number of those components together, actually, June. So we should maybe sort of think about what the action is from that after the meeting. But I think there is a need to come back to what happens when things go wrong. I think that's a very helpful suggestion, Anthony. Barbara, I think you wanted to make a comment.
Yes, I found a gap that I couldn't quite explain in the executive groups. We plan to have 6 chief officers as well as the chief executive. One of them has been quietly sitting on the board at the moment, but hasn't said much. And he and one who I think we haven't appointed yet are missing from the groups that contribute. And I wonder what's happened to the other 2 chief officers. How will they relate to the executive group?
Okay, so there's 2 more vacancies that are still to be filled, June. We know that. So can you just say a little more on that?
Yes. Clearly, the appointments exercise in August, late August, with some very successful appointments of 3 chief officers at the beginning of September has concluded. And since that time, early September, we've been out with headhunters for safety, which really is an imperative. I've been holding the fort, as you can see, on Cumberledge, etc. And that's a good transition anyway. The other one, which is around strategy, is still being sought, but I think we've got some interesting reflections from the experience of even 2 months on how the various roles come together to give an executive that's agile and makes the right decisions, but delegates to the levels where many decisions can be made without going up and down a hierarchy. So work in progress.
Yeah, I think one of the most crucial new roles is the Chief Safety Officer. I think that's a massively important role. And I think actually to make sure we get the right person, we're doing an external search on that. And I can promise you, Barbara, I'm asking June on a weekly basis for an update on where we are.
I'm asking.
I think the ones we've got are excellent in terms of leadership and imaginative management, no question, and skills and expertise.
Yeah, so we need to complete the team, I think, is what your point's very well made, Barbara. Mercy, I think you were next.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I think the paper on the whole gives me a clarity that I didn't have before, so thank you for that. But as I say, the devil is always in the detail, isn't it? And how we kind of roll it out. So it's really reassuring to hear the answer to Anthony's question as well, that is going to be worked through. I just want to know what the next steps were for the Patient and Safety Assurance Committee. Obviously, we've had early discussions about this, and now we have this paper. Just want to know, well, what's next? How far are we getting to actually setting it up?
Yep, I think the next stage is to get the detailed terms of reference and watch this space is what I will say. So I wanted, as you know, we've had a number of different discussions, but I think the first draft that we had was so long and convoluted, and it didn't have the clarity of focus. I also wanted it to be integrated as part of our other assurance committees, so we could actually be much more specific. But the next step, which we'll pick up outside the meeting, is to actually get the terms of reference in place, get the membership agreed, and that will be work that I'll be talking to each of you as non-executives in the next few weeks on that, so that by the next board meeting we should be in a better position to say where we're at. So it's weeks, not months. So Bruce, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, it's a very small point, but following on from the Patient Safety Committee, on page 6, what I wanted to say is encapsulated in one little word, which the word is, because it says that it will ensure that patient safety and patient engagement is paramount. And I'm very concerned about those 2 agendas not being the same thing. Yeah. The whole agenda of patient safety is not the same as patient engagement. And I've just detected a danger of sort of just lumping them together because it's convenient in a number of these papers, and I just caution against that.
Yeah. I specifically put the word in "and" into that bullet point, Bruce, based on your previous your mention of that very point. But for me, they are two different processes. You're quite right, and I think that's. I was trying to do a summarised version to try and provide clarity rather than getting into the too much detail, but that was the intent. So the intent is that it is two processes. So, any other questions, comments, or observations? Can I therefore just ask the board, do I have your approval that this assurance framework is actually what we'll now operate for? So looking for your approval. Thumbs up will do. Excellent. Okay, so Natalie, we could just record that the board assurance framework is approved. I think there was an important set of next steps in terms of making it a reality. The management committees are very much in train. I think we need to make sure we get the terms of reference and then the membership of the new assurance committees equally up to speed in the next month. So that's sort of what I would like to work towards. Okay, so Barbara, was there a last point?
Yes, I just wanted to add a little footnote, being as I was a healthcare provider, and that is about the response to Cumberledge and about the Patient Safety and Assurance Committee, is that we're very good and we're making great progress on getting information and input. But I think part of this, which is effectively an auditing system, is that we haven't quite made the same progress with output and closing the loop, because there's a lot of different organisations to trickle down to, and we don't have authority over many of them, although we do now have the authority to speak through the healthcare services to trusts and commissioning groups to give them effective warnings which they must acknowledge about urgent issues. And I don't know if you had a comment on that.
Not especially. Is there anything you want to add, June? I think the point's well made, though, Barbara. In terms of...
it's the challenge, and I hope that perhaps one of the useful consequences of Cumberledge that we'll be starting to be very explicit about roles and responsibilities and what we can expect from our fellow healthcare bodies.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. Thank you for that. So I think we can approve the framework. We need to make sure that we follow up what happens when things go wrong, and also then get the specific terms of the assurance committees set up. So I think on that basis we'll move on. I think in terms of item 9 and number 10, which is about key items for discussion at the next board meeting, I'll pick that up outside the meeting, I think, just for, so I want to move to public questions and answers as quickly as I can. Can I just check if there are any other urgent items for discussion right now? We've had a fairly broad discussion on a number of topics, and we've strayed a little bit off the subject from time to time, which I think has been helpful. But is there anything urgently that the board needs to discuss right now? Stunned silence means no, so that's great. Thank you for that. So that being the case then, Rachel, can we move on to what questions do members of the public have for the MHRA board?
Yeah, thank you, Chairman, and a huge thank you to members of the public, both for the questions you submitted in advance of today, but also for the steady flow of questions and comments that have been coming through. And just to say that those will all be captured and fed back to relevant colleagues after the meeting. So I thought, Chairman, we should probably start with questions on isotretinoin, because that's a product that there's been a number of questions on, and we have mentioned it earlier. So there are a number of questions, and I wanted to start with one from someone who said that the agency was concerned enough about isotretinoin-induced spontaneous suicide, sexual dysfunction and infertility to reconvene an expert working group, which has been delayed for unclear reasons. And given that young patients are at risk and uninformed, what actions can be taken by the MHRA to protect those patients in the interim? So it's this question and a number of others that have come in through the meeting are asking about the expert working group and what's happening with that.
Okay, June, could you give us an update on that, please?
Yes, glad to. Because of the importance of this signal, the working group that had been in abeyance for some little while was reconvened under Sir Munir Mohammed, and it has met, I think, 2 or 3 times now. I think it's definitely 2 and it might have been 3. So it started meeting, it has its terms of reference, and it's considering a wide range of evidence that will help to cast light on this important signal. And we're talking about psychiatric adverse reactions, sexual dysfunction, infertility, some reactions that are long lasting. So it's very important indeed. What I'd like to highlight is that thankfully, having had some issues to address in terms of the public feeding into this review, we now have a secure IT platform that will hold what is very sensitive information securely that the public and patients and families will share with us. And that will launch either next week or the week after, depending on 1 or 2 last issues to solve. But it's been approved and it will go ahead. So the question is important in that it says, is this an area where rapid advice needs to be given? Certainly the expert group knows that if there's anything that's turning up from the evidence they're sifting, advice should be given very quickly and no hold-ups in that. There are already warnings in all the materials for health professionals and for patients about the risk of psychiatric side effects and also about adverse effects like sexual dysfunction. So there is information there. What we're anticipating from the expert group is that will be made much better as a result of what patients, users of the medicine, whether they be health professionals or patients, share with us. So there is information and that will be updated as and when the review concludes. So I hope that helps for the moment, but it's being taken very seriously indeed.
Okay, so Rachel?
Yeah, thank you, June. And just a follow-up question on that one, which a couple of people have raised as to why isotretinoin hasn't already been suspended for under 18s.
Yes, it's a question that has to be asked and has to be considered carefully. And although we know that many of the patients who get huge benefit from this, and it can be complete cure, and there aren't many medicines that do that, are older, there are still conditions in younger people under 18, that are very severe and at risk permanent scarring, which we all know going through teenage years is really devastating and has a big mental health impact, particularly as you're so aware of the impact socially of a condition like this. So there are children, young people between 12 and 18 that stand the chance of huge benefit, possibly even cure, and that would give them the chance of forming their relationships and having a normal and healthy and safe social life. So the issues are challenging. What the group will be looking at is particularly the benefit risk and the different populations. And if there are any provisions that mitigate risk, they will be put in place.
Can I just come back on that one, June, a little? So I understand that there's a real need to have a balance of risk and benefit, and clearly for some patient groups, this particular drug has some important benefits. So I think it's always about getting the balance right. Just thinking about our conversation around patient involvement and engagement, could you just sort of say how you'd expect us to take into account patient views on this particular specific topic?
Yes, the consultation that's going to be launched either next week or the week after plans to start with this topic, where isotretinoin in a wide range of perspectives fits. Obviously, it was only ever licensed as use under a specialist when everything else has failed. And these are conditions that have rather complex names like cystic and conglobate acne that will result in permanent disfiguring skin conditions. So its role in the licensing terms is very strictly controlled. Of course, what we want to hear from the public, from patients and families, is their view on this. And it will not only be those who've been sharing their experiences of adverse effects, it could well be people who've had life-changing benefits. So it's something that will be weighed up very, very carefully indeed, and something that will be very alert to that challenging balancing that, Stephen, you refer to.
Exactly. Anthony, do you want to just add something to that?
I'd like to ask a question. Will we, you mentioned the consultation, will we be ensuring that that consultation is made aware to the specific professional groups in this area? Because obviously that will highlight them that there's concern, there's an issue ongoing if they haven't already heard it.
Absolutely. I don't know, Rachel, you've got at your fingertips, because your team have been incredibly helpful with this, that the outreach, obviously we always go to the British Association of Dermatologists, but there may be many others who could helpfully, from the nursing and other professions, who can help.
Okay.
Rachel,
So
you've got the we'll share it. It's pretty extensive.
So what I've heard, June, is that we're taking this issue very seriously. We need to balance risk and benefit across the patient population, and there's going to be a public consultation. So I think we want to continue this discussion. It's not just ending in this question and answer session. This is a wider topic that needs further debate. I think that's what I've heard. So, Rachel, what about other questions?
Okay, thank you. There's also been a number of questions around regulation of vaccines. So perhaps we should start with one about whether there's likely to be an approval of a COVID human challenge study. And the questioner is asking when one might be authorised to begin, or if not, is there anything preventing one from being approved?
Okay, so June, so the human challenge studies, obviously, it's not about the specifics, but it's about the principle, I think, in terms of, what would need to be done to approve such a program. And Christian may help as well in a moment.
Well, absolutely, really important area. And human challenge studies per se are not regulated unless there's an investigative medicinal product involved, in which case it would be a clinical trial. And we know from other regulators like the FDA that they have regulation in this space, which actually, as some of the comments I've heard, may not be conducive to progress. But we all know at this moment that the sooner we can have effective products, whether they're vaccines or therapeutics, the better. So it's an area we're actively exploring. And in fact, the Office of Life Sciences, excuse me, has asked for that to be expedited. The expert working group under Munir Mohammed will look at the regulatory possible approaches soon, because as an enabling regulator, we want to expedite and make safe as much as we can what may well be hugely important in terms of access to products. But Christian, would you like to come in?
Thanks, June. Thanks, Chairman. Not sure I can add much. You have summarized this very likely. So obviously, just to say to members of the public what that is, a human challenge study basically means that a person enrolled in a clinical trial would be exposed to that virus or bacterium or whatever it is, willingly and consciously, and then obviously they would, for example, be vaccinated before this. And that can help finding out if a vaccine works. That's just an example that can also be used for other areas. And that can be much faster than waiting for a natural infection to occur. And that would speed up the process considerably. Obviously, when the MHRA gets involved, June has explained this very nicely, when the MHRA would be involved in this, the safety of trial participants is our top priority. There are stringent rules for clinical trials, like good clinical practice adherence, for example, and they also require a full review of a research ethics committee. But that is not coordinated by the MHRA, that is by the Health Research Authority. So there would be a stringent system in place would the MHRA come into play.
Yeah, but that's the critical point, I think, isn't it, Christian? It's the Health Research Authority's role in terms of the ethics approvals and clearly the clinical trial design components that are vitally important to protect patients. So yeah, we're almost as the MHRA the next step on. I think it's fair to say. But,
and Sam might have something to say about how these products, these human challenge substances, might be looked at in terms of how they're manufactured, because I think we've been giving a bit of advice around that, just in terms of, you know, our general patient safety role. Sam?
Yes, thanks, June. I think with these products, I'm getting a bit of feedback. With these products, we're actually just looking at that and reviewing what our role is with these, because obviously the sponsor is responsible really for ensuring the GMP elements, I guess, are put in place for the manufacture of these products. But there is a process to go by to see whether indeed they are IMPs or not, and that is done by a clinical trials unit. So we're working with them really to look at that whole process and see whether there's further advice and support that we can provide through that whole process. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sam. Okay, Rachel, another question.
Yeah, thank you. On the theme of vaccine safety then, there is a question about what happens once a vaccine is approved and what action we would take if there were serious risks that later came to light about that specific vaccine. Would it be suspended or banned? And whether our approach as an agency would be patient safety taking precedence over pharmaceutical investment in the vaccine?
So good question, June. Do you want to just share a little more about the way that the safety vigilance will go side in side along with the
Well, certainly the preparations are pretty much nearly complete, including how we will in real time detect what we call a safety signal when there are reports more than we would expect of a particular adverse event or side effect. And therefore, as soon as we can pick something up, we're moving straight into an evaluation, and our questioner is asking quite rightly, what do you do with that evaluation? It has to be a very rigorous evaluation, because in a situation where many millions may well be vaccinated, we can all understand that events happen anyway. By coincidence, they may be associated with vaccine administration, and therefore we need to look at what risks are attributable to that vaccine. And that's a process that we prepare for very carefully using our clinical practice research data link. So we will know the kinds of things that happen in a particular population. Something might be like a heart attack. You'll be able to start to break down and look to see what you would look for. So the first stage in that signal is what you observe against what you expect and what may be just something that has sadly maybe just happened. We then will have a process of rigorous risk evaluation and involve our independent expert committees who've already been looking at the kinds of adverse events we need to be especially looking for and setting up studies. So sometimes when it's a rarer issue, we need to have a specific design and use our many links with academia, the research community, to undertake studies for us. And Public Health England is a very important ally in this too. So in terms of regulatory powers, there are powers to require further studies. There are powers to amend an authorisation if there's a particular population at risk, an age group or pregnancy or a child, for example. You can restrict or you can suspend or revoke. And those are the very basic regulatory tools. Do we ever need to do that with a vaccine? It's enormously rare because of the huge amount of work that goes in before it's deployed, testing in many thousands as to the efficacy and picking up what safety we can there. So hugely intense, and we'll be asking for safety follow-up as part of our approval system. So I hope that gives you a bit of an overview, but I know that Christian's been so closely involved in this, he's probably got some more highlights to give. Christian.
Yeah. Christian, just add your perspective.
Thanks, if I may. Thanks, Chairman. Just to say that the MHRA has been a leader in the field of safety and vigilance of medicinal products. So I think this is an important thing to highlight, just as June has just explained. June has also very well explained that this is a balance against the benefits that we would have to undertake. So this is a case-by-case decision. Obviously, it's difficult to know if we haven't seen a serious adverse event, what that is and how it would compare to the benefits of a vaccine. Just to say that many people will have been studied in a clinical trial already before for the time of approval, much more than for many therapeutics. It's just how it is with vaccines. So you test a number of people before. And finally, I'd like to make this very clear that the agency is absolutely independent of any pharmaceutical investment or any interest there, just to make this very clear, because that was part of the question. And I'd just like to make this very clear that the decision of the agency will only look at the benefits and the risks and the science and nothing else.
I think that's a very nice way to finish that particular question, Christian, because it's we will not compromise. I think that's basically what I've heard and absolutely believe. So hopefully that answers that particular question. Another one, Rachel.
Yeah. Thank you. And there's been a number of questions and comments about the importance of patient and public involvement, which has come through in a number of the discussions. But a question about how the MHRA will involve patient experts in the specific areas of the diseases or drugs that are being appraised, rather than general experts. So would the agency bring in experts or patients with a specific disease as those products were being appraised?
I think that's a very good point, and I would expect the answer to be yes, June, but I think Sam's got a hand up, so why don't we let Sam take this one.
Thank you, June. I don't want to jump in, but I've just got a nice example which might just explain how we do this. I mean, the MHRA recall that we had, actually, we involved patient groups in this and especially consulting with them in terms of communications to patients. So the expert group actually included family members of patients, and obviously they were able to bring in their valuable contributions to this in order to actually impact the output. It follows on from some of the questions and discussions we were having earlier, but I thought it was a nice example that perhaps would depict the sort of thing we do.
Okay. And you want to add?
Yes, well, I mean, Sam's absolutely right. And this was the adrenaline auto-injector. And anyone who remembers some of the news coverage would share our view that the families have been amazing to come forward to help us design better information and make more user-friendly decisions out of it. But I think it's going back to Bruce's point that how are we going to do this systematically, rather than, if you like, on a special occasion where we know that we do need to take patient groups with us. And I know, Rachel, you're thinking very much for our onward strategy, how we can make that. And I think one of the principles is that every team should be empowered, and we will not make any decision at one of our expert committees like the CHM unless there's a patient perspective. So it's got to be systematic, but there's an infrastructure issue in that question about how we make it that we know who the appropriate people are, that we actually give them the time and are supported to make their contribution, and that they know that it's taken on board. What have we done with it? So Stephen, if you're happy, I think Rachel might give us a bit on the new system approach.
Okay, so Rachel, then Christian.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, just point, what we're looking at is how we embed this systematically in our processes across the organisation, rather than perhaps depending a little about the different issues we're looking at. So systematic embedding in processes and responsibility for all teams to consider patient engagement is exactly where we're going.
And particularly bringing in experts to specific discussions that require expert opinion. I think that was also the
yes,
point.
indeed, yes.
And Christine, was there anything else you wanted to add to that?
If I may, Chairman, just very briefly, the agency is developing an ambitious new licensing pathway. So that's the innovative licensing and access pathway. And patients' involvement in this is absolutely essential, and that is product specific. So we are working, this was what was mentioned before, that there is a pilot running. We have engaged with patients, and we will obviously continue to do so once this is launched. And that is indeed product or indication specific. And we have to figure out how we best integrate the views of patients there. And we will do this. So that is on the top of the agenda, because obviously when our ambition is that we reduce the time to market, the time to patient, then obviously we need to have the patient involved with this, so that we are sure that we're doing the right thing.
Is it a quick follow-up, Anthony? Because I'd like to try and take another question if I can.
Yeah, it's actually a quick follow-up related to the fact that in this new innovative system, Christian and June, it's been highlighted at previous meetings, but not in the public, that we will actually be working with manufacturers on their methodology. So we will actually be driving manufacturers to include patient-reported outcomes in their studies where appropriate, which will mean directly patients will also be involved, which I think is going to be critical. So not only with us, but in the development of the initial evidence as well.
Absolutely.
I think that's helpful, because I think, broadly, what we were looking to do here, the answer is yes. There will be expert opportunities for expert patient groups to be able to provide input. It's all part of designing the new regulatory systems, which is primarily going to be done next year. So this is actually very much work in progress, and the questionnaire, we really thank you for your input, because it just keeps us focused on what we need to do. So Rachel, I think we've got time for one more question. So let's make it a good one to finish.
Yeah, I was going to go back to diversity and inclusion, actually, where there's a question asking how the post of the responsibilities of the diversity and wellbeing lead will be different from previous similar posts to ensure the outcomes for people of colour are improved.
So John, obviously you've got John Fundry, you've got responsibility for HR in your portfolio. Do you want to take that one?
I'm happy to do so. I mean, to be honest, I don't think it's going to be, well, so the good news is, yes, we'll have a dedicated individual focusing on this, but it's also worth saying that we've had a fair amount underway with particular networks, focuses, particular events, ongoing for some time. So I don't think this is a radically different approach. We're just giving a little bit more focus and resource onto it, would be my perspective.
Okay.
Open to other comments.
Okay, June, do you want to have the final say on that particular point?
Yes, it certainly, as John says, building on what's been done, but I think we're aiming for a step change, quite frankly, and it came out of some of the conversation that we've had about not internal but external services too. And the individual I hope the board come to know her, she's an exceptionally effective person. So I think, coupled with our ambition to build on what's been done, it should be a new level of effectiveness in this area, which we all know needs to be urgently addressed.
Yeah, well, I massively believe the strength of its team and an organisation comes from its diversity, not from its similarity. And I think there's more work to be done in this area for us as an organisation. I think as we go through further recruitments, not only at the board level, but through the organisation, we need to make sure that we're including the broadest, base of individuals into that particular process to strengthen and actually help the organisation to be successful in the longer term. Okay, so I've got one final question, Rachel, and that one's to you. There's obviously been a lot of questions that have come in. There may well be questions that there's not been time to ask. Can I just ask how they're going to be followed up with the individuals that have raised them?
Yes, certainly. So we've got a record of all the very different questions that have come through and the people that have asked them. So if the questions haven't been addressed today, we'll go back directly to those involved.
Thank you. That would be very helpful. I think that just sort of completes the loop on that. So, okay, I think we're out of time now, but I do thank everybody for your participation in today's meeting. I think that we've actually, very much focused around our strategic priorities, which was the whole aim of this particular board meeting. So patient safety has been mentioned in just about every single paper, and rightly so. We've talked about healthcare access, and particularly around COVID vaccines, and also around EU transition, practical things that we need to address. We've also talked about, the dynamic organisation, not just from a diversity point of view, just in that last question, but also how the board operates and how the organisation gains its assurance. So I think we've done a number of things. I think for future meetings, we will need to come back to financial sustainability as our fourth strategic objective, but there's still more work to be done. But I do thank you for your input today. Thank you very much for listening. If there are any more feedback from members of the public on how this has been received, how we could improve this format for the future, we'd be very grateful to receive that. All that leaves me to say now is to thank you for your time, and we'll see you next time. Okay, bye-bye for now.